Hello everyone, John Greenwood here with a new video doing some actual history. I've read the research of a few PhDs in Germany who will remain unnamed, who claim that there are no surviving games of Kriegsspiel from the Prussian War College. We know that they played the games, but they don't seem to have written any of them down, as we have no official documents from the Prussian War College. However, there are unofficial documents of games played at the Prussian War College, and I was able to find one. So today we're going to be exploring what is, to my knowledge, the only surviving game of Kriegsspiel from the Prussian War College, recorded during its heyday in the 1870s. This is a fascinating little historical curiosity. It's not published by the War College themselves. Instead, it's found in a lifestyle magazine for the bourgeoisie of the period called Daheim, aka the home or the house. It's a home life magazine, and since the war just ended, they're trying to advertise that former officers can buy the game to play at home, because the designers suddenly needed money now that it was peacetime, and all the officers had been trained in an actual war instead of their games. The article can be found on page 457 of that issue, or page 51 of the PDF version of it. Here's what that looks like. The start of the article briefly explains what Kriegsspiel is and the general principles of play, which can already be found in the rulebook itself, so we're not going to go over it here. But the reason for this is that it's an advertisement, and it might be read by like a housewife or something, so it requires a little introduction to those unfamiliar with it. Anyway, skipping a bunch of tedium, here's Blue's team, here's their army composition and their officers, and here's Red's team with their army composition and officers. Here's the armies side by side. You can see that Red team outnumbers Blue team. And then here's some labels for all of the individual officers. There's Captain B and C. And under Captain B, he has Lieutenants D, E, F, and Captain C has Lieutenant G, H, and J. So after you transcribe the article and then translate it into English, one of the first tasks is to figure out this map, because it's not very readable and it doesn't include a lot of the features that are going to be referenced in the game, and so you can't really make sense of what happened on the board without all of those details. My first attempt was to reproduce a cleaner copy of the map so that we can better see what's going on, with like bold colors to clearly demarcate the woods and the highways. However, this version of the map proved insufficient, and my efforts to reconstruct the game using this version failed. The project of reconstructing this game was set aside for a year while I searched for the original map and translated the Prussian drill manuals to understand some of the unstated assumptions of the author of the article. I was able to learn quite a few things from the drill manuals that were indeed unstated assumptions in the example game, and they proved extremely helpful later on in the process. I was able to finally find the original map in March 2026. Here's the relevant section of that map. They're playing on a cross-section of half of the map that the Prussians made of Königsgrades in 1866. If we overlay the article's copy of the map on top of this, we can see that the terrain features are nearly a perfect match. The article's copy of the map seems to be a crude reproduction of this original map, lacking any of its features and being sort of warped in places, and having different locations for the labels of the towns, but otherwise it's quite clearly intended to be the same map. And for those curious, here's what the full map looks like laid out as a board, and the section of the map that we're playing on is the top half of this board. I'm going to skip the briefing included with the scenario because it's not very interesting. Basically, it's a different version of the lead up to the Battle of Königsgrades, which happened here in this white square. Here's our battlefield in real life, and here it is in game. Red's plan is to send his advance guard down the highway, scout where Blue is, and pin him there. Meanwhile, his main body is going to go around and hit either Langenhof or sweep behind Blue's defensive line and threaten his flank and line of retreat. The vanguard is ordered to take the highway, while the main body is ordered to take this road here. The main body of the cavalry are ordered to march to the right-hand side of this road, off-road. Blue expects that Red's main axis of attack will be down the highway, which is called the Gitchen Road. To stop this, Blue wants to put defenses at Lipa, with his reserves behind them in the small valley to the southeast. Keen-eyed historians will note that this deployment was an important location for the Battle of Königgrätz in 1862. And given that the players would have been familiar with the battle as part of their curriculum at the War College, it's not too far of a leap to suggest that the players are probably trying to mimic the parts of the battle that'll make their side strong and adjusting their strategy based on what didn't work in the battle historically, sort of correcting the mistakes made in the deployments used during the real battle. As a precaution, Blue orders a patrol to ride down the road from Clum to Sistos and see if Red is coming down that way to make sure that Blue can pivot in time if Red does. Blue places what little cavalry he has near Langenhof, to the left of his reserve. And here's a detailed look at Blue's defense of Lipa at the start of the game. 2 battalions occupy the town, one on the north edge and one on the south edge. The light foot battery is deployed on position A as specified in the article. The article specifies that it is deployed just behind the crest of the hill, which we can thankfully now see thanks to our more detailed copy of the map. We can deduce the position of the other artillery from the descriptions provided. The battery is placed somewhere to the right of the highway, and the battery on the road is about 500 paces left of this position. Given the fact that the umpire felt no need to draw this position or specify its location in detail, we can infer that this position must have been very obvious to them. Considering how close this would put the artillery to one of their historical positions at the Battle of Königgrätz, it's reasonable to assume that they are intended to be placed at their historical position, so that's where I've put them in the reconstruction. Blue's commander-in-chief places himself with this artillery on the hill. The position of his lieutenant was not specified, but it's with one of the artillery pieces, so I put him with the heavy battery for now and decided I would correct it later if needed, and indeed it's at battery number 2, so you're going to see me correct it. Here's what Red's camp overnight might have looked like. We don't get any specifics about what it looked like apart from the vague statement that it was behind the Hollewald. It doesn't end up being important for the game, but given how quickly Red is able to get on the road, I infer that it must have been closer to the town, where there's this open field for his men to camp and buildings for his officers to sleep in. One battalion is assigned to occupy Dohalika, and another occupies Sadova, while patrols are sent out to the other side of the woods to scout a bit and ensure that Blue doesn't ambush them overnight. By the morning, here's what their forces roughly look like. Overnight, both Red and Blue's sentries and patrols are active, and the umpire gives both sides a chance to change their dispositions with their new information. The article records this as happening in the first 4 minutes of in-game time, but this clearly occurred after the deployment phase. Blue's patrol rode overnight to Sistos and reports that there's no Reds in the area. He can't see much beyond the town because of this ridge that's in the way. Another Blue patrol rode to Tresovitz and reports no Reds in that direction. Red patrols tried to scout ahead to Lipa overnight, but they had to fall back due to infantry fire from the town. They report seeing defenses being prepared in the outskirts of the town and behind it. Here, Red and Blue patrols go down the same road and sort of get mutually repulsed. The author of the article writes that Blue was informed of this, but neglects to mention whether Red was informed. It appears that Red was not informed of this, based on the lack of evidence and his conduct through the rest of the game. This is one of the mistakes that the umpire will make during this game, which I'll point out over the course of the game as they sort of occur, because it's interesting to see whether the Prussians made mistakes while running the game and what kind of mistakes. It should also make modern umpires a bit more confident in their own abilities to know that the people who invented this game couldn't run it perfectly. The author of the article notes that because of the patrol movements overnight, Red sentries get placed on Blue's board, meaning they aren't hidden by the fog of war anymore. Blue also put some cavalry on the Clum Heights to oversee the battle and send constant updates to Blue HQ. These scouts are able to see Red's patrols, along with Red's infantry in Sadova, which had to physically walk from its rear guard back into position with the main body by dawn. The men on the heights were able to see this movement, giving Blue more intel. The men on the heights were also able to see numerous campfires behind the woods overnight, giving Blue some idea of where Red's main body will come from. With all of this intelligence, neither side chooses to do anything differently, and Red gives their marching orders. Red's underlings, his lieutenants, are the ones who tell the umpires their specific marching order. This is very different to how umpires run Kriegsspiel today, where either the umpire tells you exactly where you deployed, or the deployment is left to your higher commanders. Here, in this game, the underlings are laying out the specifics of the deployment, and therefore are kept involved in the process of the game. This detail reveals that the marching order of a detachment was left up to the commander of that detachment, and your senior officer was expected to keep their nose out of your business. We're going to look at Red's marching orders because they reveal a shocking amount of information. We'll turn to the simplified version of the map just for clarity's sake before switching back. Lieutenant F deploys the cavalry like so, with the horse artillery behind the first squadron. The author notes that this was the correct placement according to the Prussian War College. So already we've learned a little bit about some of the lessons taught at the Prussian War College. Lieutenant E does something similar. He deploys his main body of infantry like so, with the artillery behind the 1st Battalion. The author notes that this is also the correct placement according to the Prussian War College. We should also pay note to the fact that it was the underling who decided the marching order of the detachment, even though his commanding officer is physically present in the same detachment. This just isn't the type of detail that the commander involved himself with, and it was improper to do so. He just trusted his lieutenant to do a good job, and according to the author, he did do a good job. The HQ token has been placed at the front of the column to indicate the rough position of the officers here, but in actuality it would be more like on top or to the right of the 1st Battalion according to regulations. It was just put in front for legibility's sake and for my own convenience, and it's not super important right now. Lieutenant F deploys his advance guard roughly in this order. 2 squadrons in front, followed by the artillery, then 3 battalions, and the 2nd wagon of foot artillery. We can infer all kinds of things from this deployment. First, that cavalry go in front, which is obvious even to us nowadays. It just makes sense to put the horses in front, because they go faster and will be held up behind the infantry. Note that on the road his cavalry are going to need to unstack, but that's fine for now. Lieutenant F puts his artillery in front of his infantry, which is different from many wargamers today. When you think about it, this makes more sense than putting it behind the infantry, because your infantry are going to take potentially up to 15 to 45 minutes to line up for an assault, so you want to give them breathing room to deploy. The way you can do that is to control the space, and you can control the space with suppressive fire from the artillery. It also lets us infer that it is somewhat of a standard practice to deploy your artillery to the right of your infantry, which we'll see happen in this game. The way that a battle line is formed is that you line up with the guy on your right, according to regulations. When you're lining up, you physically look to your right-hand side and line up based on how the guy is standing to your right. In a column, the first guy to line up serves as the right-hand anchor point for the rest of the battle line. So if you put the artillery in front, that means that they're going to form this right anchor, because you can't put your artillery behind your infantry or else there'll be friendly fire. The logical place to put the artillery is to the right. Now obviously there are exceptions, but this is something really interesting that we can infer based on this marching order. Another clever trick that Red has used here is to put his 2nd artillery wagon behind the infantry, to speed up the approach of his infantry by a whole minute. The battery wouldn't need the 2nd wagon of ammo before it arrived on location, so he doesn't really lose anything here. His column becomes a little bit more compact and more protected, so this is a neat little trick. At this point, the author of the article writes that Red deployed engineers along both paths, but doesn't elaborate on this at all. He says that they're the size of detachments, so I assume he means like skirmish block size, but other than that I have no idea if they're at the front or the back or to the side. The drill books say nothing about the engineers either, so I really don't know, and they're never mentioned ever again in the entire game. So just a big fat question mark on use of engineers. Anyways, with Red deployed, the umpire decides that the time is 0530 and the clock starts to tick. This in-game clock moves in real time. If 2 minutes pass in real life, then 2 minutes pass in the game, or at least that's how it's supposed to work. The game operates in 2-minute ticks, but since that would be too logistically difficult to update, the Prussians mostly choose to update the game every 2 ticks. Basically, the game moves along in 4-minute chunks at a time, both in-game and in real life. Lieutenant J with the reserve decides that he wants to make an adjustment right away. He wants to take 2 battalions and the cavalry to occupy Langenhof. The order is delayed from being carried out because of the rules about couriers. Lieutenant J's orders need to be physically delivered to the cavalry, which will take 2 minutes. In any case, Blue orders only 2 out of 4 of his reserve for this purpose. The author doesn't specify which 2 because it must be very obvious to the officers back then. Thinking about it logically, we can infer that it's the first 2, since the officer himself wants to march with the infantry, and he would be placed at the front of this column. And he thinks that he shouldn't be delayed from this move. Technically, even though Blue should be able to move 200 paces of this journey, it seems that even the Prussians have some sense of streamlining things for convenience, and they seem to choose to wait until the next turn to process this move, instead of waiting for the more accurate 2-minute tick. Over on the other side of the board, Red has split his forces in 2. The advance guard is going down the highway as planned, while the main body and cavalry marches down the road through Upper Tohalitz. He wants 2 battalions to split off and march through the forest on the path marked as Lilac. I assume that this is to save road space. The rest of the infantry march straight into Upper Tohalitz along the road as planned, and the cavalry march to the right of the road, ahead to Langenhof, where Red thinks that Blue hasn't left many defenses. He thinks that this maneuver will threaten Blue's flank and line of retreat, unaware that Blue's reserve is close by because they're hiding behind the hills and ridges. Red's advance guard reaches the middle of the forest, traveling at 200 paces per minute via a trot and walk. The main body is noted as starting to enter Upper Tohalitz at 0534 after traveling for 400 paces. We're able to get their starting position by just measuring backwards. It's here that the article gives an idle mention that Red's skirmishers reached Upper Tohalitz, meaning that the skirmishers are already deployed while on the march into battle, or at least some of them. I took the liberty of interpreting this as the skirmishers of the 1st Battalion alone. Otherwise, the Reds would have had to stand around and wait a lot for the other skirmishers to march up ahead. I think this makes the most sense to me and kind of checks out with how the rest of the battle plays out. And it's one of those things that, if you think about it, actually makes a lot of sense. Similar to the story with the artillery being in second place, you kind of need time and space for the rest of your infantry to get into place. So having the skirmishers of at least the 1st Battalion being already deployed gives you some of that space. Otherwise, the 1st Battalion would be just kind of sitting there like ducks, absorbing all kinds of infantry fire, while their friends get out of column and into battle line. The skirmishers in the front absorb most of that heat, like they're meant to do. It's these small offhand remarks that make this game a historical treasure trove, because this information is not recorded anywhere in the drill manuals, and since it isn't written down anywhere, we must infer that this would have been something that you learn in the Prussian War College. So of course you know that the skirmishers were deployed. Duh, everyone knows that. It's so obvious that the author only mentions it in passing, and we're lucky enough to catch it. Here you can see one of my HP tokens in action. The range is from 1 to 10. With 10 meaning that the unit is half dead and removed from the board. 0, or no marker, means no damage. 20 HP is the full pool of the entire battalion. Why has the 1st Battalion lost HP? Because it's deployed 2 skirmish blocks. A battalion is technically made up of 8 platoons. That works out to 2.5 HP per skirmish block. Lose 4 platoons and you've lost half of your 8 that make up the battalion. 4 platoons times 2.5 HP is 10 HP, so the math checks out here, guys. Here, Reds deployed 2 skirmish blocks, and so they've technically lost 5 HP. They'll get it back if the skirmish blocks return. I am not sure whether the Prussians tracked HP in this game. Having analyzed the full game now and tracking HP on my own, it really doesn't seem like they did. But I thought that I would, just to see if they made any serious mistakes, and I used average damage for this game to remove a lot of the elements of randomness. And yeah, having tracked the damage myself, it really doesn't seem like they seriously tracked damage in this way. So this is kind of one of those rules that exists on paper but which aren't followed in practice. Over here you can see that Lieutenant E has ordered his artillery ahead. This would only be possible at a trot, although this is unstated by the article. He wants to protect the main body of the infantry as it debouches into the valley, and orders it to deploy on the hill. However, the author of the article has made a sort of language fib here. It hasn't actually moved there yet. He was just explaining with really poor language choice that the player had ordered the artillery to go here, so we'll see a correction soon enough. Anyways, the head of the cavalry brigade has arrived in the valley depression southeast of Upper Dohalik, making it visible to blue. And the advance guard also becomes visible to blue. And the battery on the hill is visible to blue as well. If he didn't have an idea of where red was coming from before, then he certainly does now. And here's what the overhead looks like at 5:36. Blue orders the foot battery on the road to relimber and redeploy behind the ridge between Clume and Langenhof, which is conveniently marked for us on the article's map. The article claims that this is about 500 paces north of Langenhof, but it's actually closer to 800 paces, so you need to take the author's measurements with a grain of salt because he gets them wrong frequently. And as a minor correction, since the order for the artillery has no delay, we can infer that Lieutenant H was placed with the battery on the road, and that he was the one to order the artillery to be repositioned after seeing red appear on the map. The 2 battalions directed towards Langenhof have now completed 2 moves and are still about 4 minutes away from the village, while the cavalry is already close to the sheep farm. This is given in a passing reference as if everybody knows what he's talking about, because everybody would know what he's talking about. The sheep farm is a famous site at the Battle of Königsgrades. It's one of the buildings that's marked here on the map. The full extent of the sheep farm is marked on the map with dashed lines for its fences, like so. By 5:36, the advance guard have reached the edge of the woods and the artillery starts deploying. They would have needed to trot for 4 minutes to reach this position, meaning that the trot was ordered earlier, and the author of the article is not very good at writing, and is probably reciting this game from memory rather than some sort of written record from the War College. This strongly implies that the War College did not keep written records of their games, which would coincide with the fact that we have no written records from the War College of the games they ran, except for this unofficial one. Anyways, the vanguard artillery is ordered not to fire unless fired upon. The artillery is noted as reaching the hill, as ordered in 0536, and needs a tick, i.e. 2 minutes, to deploy. So it seems that the umpire made a mistake in making this artillery visible earlier because the hill would have hidden the artillery. Also, it means that the artillery didn't trot into position, it was just being ordered to move here at the time mentioned earlier. Moving on to the cavalry, the scouts of the cavalry brigade have reached the foot of the hill marked as 684 on the map. Lieutenant F orders his battery to move up onto that hill. This is a partial understanding of the situation at 0540, except for the vanguard. Their artillery and cavalry at the front are their actual positions, but you'll notice that the infantry have kind of teleported. The positions of the infantry in the vanguard are more aspirational than their actual positions. I was just marking where they're going to be in about 20 minutes. Blue orders his artillery to start firing once it's in position. As with Red's light artillery, we can infer that Blue ordered his artillery to trot back when he ordered them here before, which means that even this foot artillery can actually trot, and it confirms that foot artillery is just kind of a name. It's actually still pulled by horses. So that raises a little bit of confusion as to what is meant by a horse artillery. I'm not sure what the exact difference is if they can both trot. Maybe one can gallop and one can't. I'm not really too sure, but all of this artillery is being pulled by horses, which means that it can go at least at a trot. With Blue's battery firing on Red, Red's batteries return fire. Blue's battery in the middle is ordered to fire at the vanguard, but to switch targets and fire at Upper Dohalitz if a larger body comes out, which is exactly what happens. Since they only fired for like 2 to 4 minutes at the vanguard at extreme range, the umpire hand waves the result and says that nothing happens to Red's vanguard. I think this is a wise decision. After that, the author of the article uses confusing language, but it's clarified in later turns that the artillery from now on is only firing at these guys here in the main body. Aside from splitting up so that the artillery is left with half a squad's worth of guards, the cavalry are left unmentioned for a really long time. I thought perhaps that they had been killed off by artillery fire because of how long they went unmentioned. But given the fact that they reappear later in the battle, they had to hide somewhere so that Blue's artillery doesn't kill them. And it would have needed to be so obvious that the article didn't feel the need to mention it. That position is behind Hill 684, which would give them ample room to hide this whole formation in waiting. At this point, the article has a huge time skip while these two formations deploy for battle. The vanguard will deploy as depicted, but Red's main formation will use a bit of a weird attack line that I'll get into. In the meantime, while this is happening, Blue continues pounding away at Red's main column at extreme range. The article marks this as 2,500 paces, but it's actually 2,100, so he's making more mistakes with the distances. In practical terms, there's no difference in the results. Skirmishers are not going to take meaningful casualties from artillery fire until closer to 1,200 paces, which explains why the umpires decided to hand-wave this engagement too and only inflict minor fatigue penalties against Red. Again, I think this is a wise decision. The article mentions that the occupation of Lipa is announced by skirmisher fire. All of a sudden, Blue has skirmishers in front of him, and there was no prior mention of them. This means that it's so obvious that it's not worth mentioning. Even in the defense of a town, skirmishers are deployed forward out of the prepared defenses to take pot shots at Red. Thanks to the extreme distance and the cover involved, this has no effect. Then, within the same turn, all of a sudden, the article mentions that Blue's battalions had reached Langenhof. This article is getting really sloppy here, and is blending a few turns together for the sake of simplicity. In reality, this would have happened around 5:44, according to the marching speed of the units. He orders 2 companies to occupy the village and keeps the rest hidden in this small depression to the east of the village. No mention is made of what the cavalry is doing, and here's an overhead view of that. Already, I've got a few questions in my head, like why doesn't the artillery fire on Blue's skirmishers where they would have had better effect? Is it because he's worried about shelling the village? I don't really know. And why doesn't Blue send his skirmishers to harass and interrupt Red's deployment? It seems like he could at least get rid of the cavalry before returning back to Lipa. And as for why Red's horse artillery doesn't fire on Blue's artillery here, I had lots of questions about that, but after analyzing the situation a bit, it's because there's a hill in the way. Red's height is about 650, while Blue's is about 740, and there's a hill almost 740 high directly in the way. So he's aware of Blue's artillery, but can't get a good angle on it. Even the artillery that Red currently has firing on Blue also has a poor angle of fire on them. By 6:08, Red's forces are in attack formation and have deployed skirmish shields. They've been deployed in a non-standard attack formation because Red wants to keep a reserve. We know that they're not in a standard formation for 2 reasons. First, the author had to specify the formation, and second, because the drill manuals lay out the formation of a standard attack. The skirmish shield in front takes no damage over the course of this deployment, despite advancing a little further. Remember, they have to be like 1,200 paces to take meaningful casualties. So the umpire deems them just kind of lightly shaken by the artillery fire instead of taking any losses. Here's an overhead view of the situation. At this point, although it isn't mentioned, the umpires would probably have most of Red's army visible on Blue's map of the game due to Blue's observers on the Clume Heights. Red orders his heavy battery and his horse battery to deploy along the ridge west of Langenhof, as indicated on the article's map. The main body is similarly ordered to advance towards Langenhof, and Lieutenant D with the vanguard sees that the rest of Red is advancing, so he orders his attack. The heavy battery gets the order to redeploy instantly, but the horse battery takes 2 minutes to get the order. The heavy battery is marching at a trot into place at 300 paces per minute. After 4 minutes, this is their position according to the rules as written. The article asserts that the foot artillery should be 1,000 paces from its intended position, and the horse artillery should already be deployed by 0610. However, this is an error from the umpire. There is simply no way that the horse artillery could have been deployed in time, even if it galloped at full tilt, which it didn't, as the article specifies that he trotted here at 300 paces per minute, which is a trot. So for this to be true, the artillery would have needed to be deployed on the far side of 684, which the article fails to mention. And not to mention the tick that the artillery needs to spend limbering and unlimbering, which would mean it cannot be deployed even in the situation that the author claims that the artillery is in. This is a pretty serious mistake in terms of the rules. It goes to show that the umpires must have been rushed. But we move on, correcting the article as we go. With all of the corrections in mind, this was the situation at 610, ignoring the serious mistakes of the umpire and the article. Lieutenant D orders his artillery to fire on the town of Lipa with the advance. I was initially not sure why the umpires allowed this to happen, and I assumed that this was probably another mistake. The reason that I assume it's a mistake is because if the vanguard is advancing, then the line of fire crosses the path of his advancing columns, and the shells would hit his own troops. However, looking ahead, no mention is made of the advance of the vanguard for several turns, which means that the author misspoke again. The vanguard did not advance. It ordered to prepare for the advance with the artillery barrage, and now the umpire decision to allow this makes a lot more sense. By 618, the assault continues, and Red's artillery has deployed on the ridge and will soon open fire on Blue's artillery. Meanwhile, Blue's light artillery remains focused on Red's main advance. Red's line starts to close the gap, and by this point Red should be taking some damage, but we have no indication that he does, which would be another serious error in the rules as written. There are also rules for advancing under artillery fire which seem to have been ignored, because there's no mention of them. This is probably another mistake, or it could be that they're not intended to kick in until the range is closer, but in any case, the artillery can definitely see Red's infantry advancing here, and it should have had some kind of effect, but it doesn't. By 630, the infantry should be touching Blue's artillery, but they aren't somehow. I don't know. It's not mentioned anywhere in the article. I can't really explain what happened here, and the article's explanations for what is going on have just completely fallen apart at this point, and you're going to see a lot of this happening more and more as we go. After a bit of adjustment, I thought maybe this seems like a plausible position for the main body, but after reading the article over again, it does actually seem like the infantry just kind of walked up to the artillery and took it. As we can see, the article is not doing a very good job of explaining itself. The engagement here should have been resolved ages ago, and the reason that it hasn't soon becomes clear. And again, it's a case of the article messing up with its language and not telling us things. Out of nowhere, the article mentions that, oh yeah, Blue's heavy artillery is to the right of Langenhof somewhere, and Red's artillery was actually firing at that battery, not the one right next to it, and oh yeah, they've been in an artillery duel for 20 minutes now. I mean, come on, man, really? So the situation looks more like this instead, which makes a little more sense, but there's still some strange stuff going on. Anyways, this is a fairly lopsided duel, so of course Blue loses and is forced to retreat. It travels 1,100 paces to this position marked on the article's map, and so we're able to deduce where it moved from based on that description, which puts it here on the right-hand side of Langenhof. This just really pops out of nowhere in the text, and I'm sure you're sensing my frustration with this article. Red's vanguard starts to advance in earnest, and by 6:30 they arrive at Lipa. This time I am dead certain that the umpires are ignoring the rules on advancing under fire, as the rules are extremely clear in this case. Also, Blue has done no damage to Red's skirmishers, despite the fact that some damage would have been inflicted, and Red's skirmishers might have even been destroyed under the rules as written. So I'm starting to feel some frustration on behalf of Blue, because the umpires keep making serious mistakes in favor of Red. By 6:40, Blue's heavy artillery battery has stopped routing and arrive at their new deployment. Lieutenant J responds to the threat at Langenhof by mobilizing the reserves. He orders all the remaining battalions to make their way to Langenhof, delivering the orders personally to the reserves on the highway. Meanwhile, Red orders the artillery to attack Langenhof. Don't know why they don't attack Blue's light artillery that is apparently right next to them, but knowing this article, it's probably all the way in Alpha Centauri by now. And indeed, it is never mentioned again in the entire article, which kind of goes to suggest that the infantry did, in fact, just kind of walk up to the artillery and take it. What a mess. Anyways, Lieutenant F wants to threaten Blue's flanks, so he orders cavalry to swing around and cross the creek. Lieutenant J on Team Blue accepts the attack and lines up the cavalry sort of near the sheep farm behind Langenhof. As the first 3 squadrons cross, Blue charges. The umpire considers the situation analogous to cavalry trying to cross trenches and uses those rules, which provides that Red will be at a serious disadvantage. Red breaks and is forced to retreat. Red intends to repeat the attack with another wave, further south, but Blue doesn't accept this engagement and retreats to the sheep farm, giving space for Red to cross. By 6:50, Blue's reserve has reached Langenhof. The rest of the battle doesn't mention Blue's light battery in the center, so given that we previously said that Red's infantry was on top of them, that must have been actually correct, and Blue's artillery must have been captured. At 700 hours, Red begins a simultaneous assault on both Lipa and Langenhof. We can therefore infer that the Red CIC sent couriers around beforehand to schedule this time of attack. And then by 8:06, the assault is finished and the umpire calls the game. We don't really have the details of the assaults because the author of the article doesn't go into that much detail, but he gives a little bit of information, so we'll look at that. First, let's look at the attack on Lipa. Red has 2 battalions, and for some reason the article asserts that Blue only has 1. I don't know about you, but I count 2. The article then further asserts that Blue only ever deployed 1 battalion in Lipa and didn't deploy 2 there, which is just not true. An entire battalion just vanishes into thin air for Blue, I guess. In the next phase of the assault, Blue retreats, and then the article states that Blue brings his battalion from behind Lipa into action. This must refer to our missing battalion, and so we can infer that this battalion was moved behind Lipa at some point, which is yet another instance of these phantom maneuvers failing to be mentioned by the article. And this battalion is now being brought up as the reserve to counterattack against Red's 2 battalions. So it must look something like this, I guess. The counterattack is successful, and Blue pushes Red out of Lipa. And by that point, Red's reserve battalion would be brought in while Red's main attack recovers, repeating the process. Now for Red's assault on Langenhof. He orders 2 battalions to attack the village. Due to threats on all sides, Blue has only 1 battalion to oppose them and is pushed back, starting the fight for the town's interior. Blue sends in his reserve battalion to fight the fire, now 2 on 2, but it's not enough and he's pushed out of Langenhof. Blue CIC arrives personally to try to stop the collapse. He orders a full counterattack with all units in the area. However, the 2 battalions that were defending Langenhof are still repulsed under the rules and are unable to attack. The umpires carry out Blue's attack without these units anyways, and only remind Blue of this rule after it occurs. Meanwhile, on the other side, Red defends with 4 battalions, leaving only 1 in reserve. However, the umpires finally decide to take account of Red's losses here. They decide that after taking so much rifle and artillery fire, there's just no way that Red is at full strength. They decide that Red's forces would be so depleted by this time that their strength would be equal to these 2 Blue battalions, and decide that, in terms of numbers, both sides are even, with Blue getting a slight disadvantage for attacking the village. Blue rules poorly and is shattered. Blue orders a general retreat to a defensive line along the highway and the sunken road between Clume and Langenhof. The time is 8:06 and the umpire calls the game. With the players gathered, he gives feedback to both sides. In terms of plans, out of the 2 main commanders in the exercise, he had the most issues with Red's plans. The umpire took issue with Red giving no details about the security measures taken overnight. He said, "I understand this is a war game, but that's no excuse." The umpire didn't have any issue with Red crossing behind the river and camping behind the forest. That approach makes sense, because it avoids the time-consuming process of moving out of Sadova and Lower Dohalitz. To move out of those towns at the start of the game, Red would have needed to cross the bridges, which are narrow and only allow a portion of Red's forces to cross at a time, so it was smart to cross the river overnight instead. However, Red made no mention of how he planned to secure this position overnight. It reads as though his army is camped behind an empty forest with just 2 weak cavalry patrols as his only outposts, right beside the enemy. And the umpire emphasizes by implication that this is basically no protection at all. In a real situation, the umpire says that maybe common sense would save him. The infantry camped behind the forest would likely push their lookout positions forward into the middle of the forest, and their listening posts to the eastern edge out of their own initiative. These measures might prevent the worst from a surprise attack, but a commander can't rely on the initiative of his subordinates when the security of the entire detachment is at stake. In fact, the umpire says that Red should have gone even further than he did, and should have moved his infantry to secure the far edge of the woods before the battle, despite the fatigue this would have inflicted on his forces. As for Red's overall plan of a far-flung flanking maneuver using a small pinning force while the main body went around, the umpire refuses to criticize Red for it, largely because it worked. The parameters of the scenario sort of suggested an encirclement, because Red knew that he had a significant cavalry superiority. It was a risky maneuver, and it would have been less risky if Red committed fewer non-cavalry resources to the flanking maneuver. But the umpire can't argue with the boldness because the outcome worked in Red's favor. Switching to Blue, the umpire thought that Blue's plans were reasonable and really has no criticism. Blue placed his batteries in good positions and kept most of his infantry together in a solid formation. That's sound tactics. His issues lie with Blue's strategy during the game itself. Blue faced a superior force at Lipa. Given that, there was little reason to defend it to the last man. There was excellent defensive ground just 1,500 paces behind Lipa at the heights of Clume. This should have been Blue's real defensive position. Blue's goal at Lipa should have been only to delay the enemy, buy some time, and then fall back to Clume where he could have made a stronger stand. But the most critical moment of the game came only a few minutes into the game, when Blue saw Red was coming towards Langenhof. The umpire says that Blue made a decision that played right into Red's hands. He noticed that they were trying to flank towards Langenhof, so Blue came down from his heights, which were advantageous to his defense, to meet them in Langenhof, deep in the valley, which is disadvantageous to his defense. At the point in time when the decision was made, given their situation, which was largely shaped by Red's moves, to be honest, the umpire says that Blue really had just two good options. The bold option was to defeat Red in detail. He should have attacked the weaker column, which was Red's vanguard. Blue had a chance to overwhelm a chunk of Red's forces before the main column would have a chance to react. You may have noticed that I brought this up earlier when I was like, why isn't Blue attacking Red when he's just sitting there? The cautious option, on the other hand, was to hold their position and rely on the good defensive terrain that they'd already put work into choosing. They might have let Red come to Blue, and if pushed back, fall back to the heights of Clume. Instead, Blue chose possibly the worst option, which was to let Red set the terms of the engagement and passively react to what he was doing instead of thinking actively and strategically. Blue followed somebody else's example and split his forces in two. If Blue had more men, dividing into two halves across about 2 miles of frontage might have actually worked out for him. But Blue didn't have that many men, and they were the weaker of the two forces. Splitting up was a serious mistake. And then the umpire makes a brutal observation. Regardless of how the dice rolled in Red's favor, he could have never achieved such a win if Blue hadn't occupied Langenhof. That move handed Red the game. According to the article, the game was played over 68 ticks, or 2 hours and 15 minutes. The umpire says that in real life, the actual execution of various attacks would have taken longer, and the battle would have lasted closer to 3 hours. Within that time, Red would have accomplished his objective. He says that Red has an unobstructed path to Königsgraetz, and it's highly questionable after so much intense fighting and without any reserves left, whether Blue will even be able to reach Königsgraetz. He thinks that the troops in Lipa will be swept up in their retreat, and they'll consider themselves lucky if they can escape via Clume to the other side of the Elbe River. To put it bluntly, the umpire says that this is the worst possible outcome. However, it's not entirely hopeless, as Blue could retreat to Josefstadt first, which is 2 miles north of Königsgraetz, before moving into the city itself. Regardless, Red is too weak to encircle Königsgraetz after the battle, thanks to the losses that they sustained, which is another point in Blue's favor. The village attacks carried out by Red were generally well prepared and executed. The Umpire noticed that these attacks were always conducted in company columns. Based on his experiences in the recent war, he said that such an attack, even if initially launched in an orderly company column, will inevitably dissolve into a dense mass of fire as it progresses, basically one huge blob, and that the officers should focus on training their men to ensure that these crowds can quickly reassemble into their regulated formations. So, to put it more simply, he was saying that the assistant umpires allowed Red to reassemble into defensive formations too quickly after their attack in Langenhof, and that in a real war they would have been vulnerable to Blue's counterattack. The umpire thinks that Red should have delayed their attack on Lipa until Blue showed signs of vacating the village. Once Blue had done Red the favor of pivoting towards Langenhof, the battle was going to be decided there in Langenhof, not in Lipa, so there was no urgency to attack. Although he uses very polite words to sort of dance around the issue, the umpire basically says that Red got really lucky in Langenhof. So he doesn't want to criticize Blue's CIC for trying to retake Langenhof at all costs, especially while his right wing was still holding out in Lipa. Given how long the right wing stayed in the village, his decision may have been necessary. So the hand of Blue CIC was sort of forced by his sub-commander staying in Lipa too long. The umpire also wanted to point out a very instructive moment. He says that Lieutenant J gave us something to think about. Blue's small unit of cavalry defeated a much larger unit of Red's cavalry, which shows us two things. First, how vulnerable cavalry becomes when crossing an obstacle in front of enemy cavalry, and second, that there's a real danger of being outflanked from well-secured positions. So there's a good lesson to be learned here. Overall, the umpire says that proper tactical principles were followed during the game. The batteries were well positioned and for the most part engaged the right targets, enemy units posing the most immediate threat. As an aside, the umpire notes for his underling umpires that he saw them still using the old rules of the game, where infantry fire is effective at only 300 paces. But based on what the Prussians observed in the Franco-Prussian War, he says that the range should be increased to 500 paces. The game began in real life at 6 p.m. on a cold winter day, and at the end of the umpire's remarks, the time was recorded at 8:30 p.m., and the umpire invited everyone to dinner.